History is filled to the brim with myths and misconceptions, and the more modern they get, the more frustratingly consequential they become. And because so much of our modern world is a direct descendant of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras, well then the myths surrounding those time periods are legion. And the trouble is that a lot of these myths on their surface feel like they really don't matter much beyond the esoteric interests of, well, nerds like you and me. But I am of the opinion that even these small misconceptions oftentimes have much deeper implications at their heart. So in this video, I thought it'd be fun to take a quick little look at a couple of my favorite falsehoods about the Napoleonic Wars. The Girandoni Air Rifle was a fascinating piece of technology coming out of the late 18th century Austrian Empire. It was, exactly as it sounds, a firearm which used compressed air rather than black powder to propel rounds quietly and rapidly. When you look at just the basic statistics of the things, they sound absolutely fantastic, but a little deeper examination, and there are many reasons why the weapons never really took off. They may have been quick to fire, but after their initial air charge was depleted, they needed extensive pumping to bring them back up to pressure. They didn't have the consistency of normal flintlocks, and of course they couldn't fit a bayonet. And most importantly of all, they were incredibly complicated to manufacture and difficult to maintain in the field, to say the least. This meant that by the end of their official use in the early 19th century, they had only ever been produced by individual artisans in their hundreds, rather than the tens or even hundreds of thousands that is generally required for useful military service. Now, if you'd like to get into a lot more of those details, I actually have a video all about these things from a few years back, which I'll link down below. But suffice to say that despite the wonder of technology that these pieces represented, wonder weapons they were not, and they would only ever see exceptionally limited use in the Austrian army against the Turks, and a much more iconic usage as a demonstration weapon by the Lewis and Clark expedition in North America. So what's the myth? Well, it's one that you'll see repeated all over the internet whenever these air rifles come up. That Napoleon himself so despised these air rifles that he ordered any enemy combatant caught with one to be immediately executed without trial. Such was the French fear of these terror weapons, which killed so quickly, so silently, and without producing any smoke. But trouble is, of course, that Napoleon, in all likelihood, never even went up against one of these things. They were so limited in their use. I've heard a lot of people talk about this story, but oh, so very conveniently, nobody ever actually has a citation for it. There is, to my knowledge, from the historian's point of view, no actual reason to believe that Napoleon ever gave this technology a second thought. These sorts of myths are actually incredibly common throughout history as well, from the Germans protesting shotguns in the First World War, which is dramatically inflated, to the French cutting off the middle fingers of longbowmen in the Middle Ages. There are a few interesting layers as well to these myths every time they appear, in whatever form and to whatever extent of severity, if that makes sense. Most obviously, they represent a way to inflate the effectiveness of an individual weapon system on the battlefield. Now, I spoke about this whole deadliest warrior approach to history in a recent video, where these hyper-specific statistics are sensationally emphasized. The range of the longbow, the penetrating firepower of the blah, 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 blah. You emphasize all those, cool, heavy metal riff factors, while completely neglecting any of their context. Now, in this case, the benefits of the Girandoni system are inflated while ignoring the inherent drawbacks, which, even if it was an exciting bit of technology, a really interesting development, ultimately rendered these rifles not terribly useful for anyone to actually have in their military. At the end of the day, even if Napoleon's armies did face off against the air rifles, although again we have no proof of that, would he have even really cared? Would it have even been like a blip on his radar? Well, probably not. Less than 2,000 of these things were ever made, whereas the Napoleonic era saw armies hundreds of thousands strong. Even if we were to remove all of their drawbacks, a system with such incredibly limited deployment would never be capable of doing anything more than, well, somewhat inflating the firepower of a single battalion. Nor would it make those same men any less susceptible to artillery fire or a charge of lancers, or would it protect them from the much more numerous enemy fire. And at the end of the day, just a few of these things being inevitably lost or destroyed would represent a massive blow to the Austrian logistical lines, whereas if a regular old musket were lost, well, you just get another one. And yet the myth would have us believe that this single weapon system was so influential, so powerful, and so feared that the emperor himself would issue a formal order for the immediate execution of the individuals who bore them, as if they were sufficient to be winning entire battles, despite our not even having proof of them being present at any of them, and having struck such widespread fear into the hearts of the French who hated them so much, even more so apparently than artillerymen firing canister shot, than riflemen picking off officers from far afield, or any other terrible and indeed common part of linear warfare, which was already horrifying enough.
But do you know what isn't terrifying? That's right, the video sponsor, Exter. Let's have a quick word on their behalf.
So I rounded the corner, and there they were, 2 frogs, bayonets at the ready, and me with only that poor orphaned piglet.
So, what'd you do, Tim?
Well, it was looking rough, lads, I won't lie. I had to think fast. So I looked to the first Frenchie, and I says, bonjour, mate, parlez-vous, fisticuffs. Then I rush in before he had the chance to shoot, and bam,
Hey, sorry to interrupt. Can I speak with you, Timmy? You need us to take care of him, Tim.
No, it's fine. I'll be back soon enough, lads, no worry. What do you want, Brandon? Here to shill another product to me while I lie dying in hospital?
Look, Timmy, I'm sorry about that.
But that time is past now. I have new friends, and the only family I need is the regiment.
Can I tell you a story, little Timmy?
If it'll get you off my back, then fine, sure.
So, a couple of weeks back, I was coming back home from a big event in the city. A parking garage was an absolute bedlam, Timmy. Everyone was trying to leave all at once, and there was only a few kiosks left where we could actually pay to get out. So, eventually I make my way to the front, thinking I'm being polite and patient and courteous, yeah? I insert my ticket, I go to pay, when, well, suddenly I feel a hand tapping on my shoulder. Oh, no, I thought, did I accidentally cut the line? Is someone going to be angry with me? So I turned around and, well, I was surprised because the guy behind me is smiling at me. Hey, bro, he says to me, nice wallet. I look over and, well, that's when I realize he's holding his own wallet up to show me. I barely even noticed it at first. It was so sleek and smooth in his hands until, with just a flick of his pinky, he activated the quick card access button, shining forth just a beautiful fan of up to 12 debit and credit cards, plus room for cash inside as well. Timmy, that was an Exter wallet, the exact same style as I had in my own hands. Hey, I said, nice. Part of me wanted to tell him my story. I wanted to tell him about how good Exter has been to me with all these sponsorships. Tell him about how if he just used my code BRANDONF at his checkout, he could get up to 45% off of his own order. But the crowds, they were building up all around the kiosk. I had to make my payment, and time was running out. So not knowing what to say, I just kind of awkwardly turned around and I finished my payment. And you know what, Timmy, is that wouldn't have happened without that Exter wallet. Plus, of course, the solar charged GPS tracking card that lasts for up to 2 months with only 2 hours of charge. But, Timmy, do you know what I'm trying to say to you with all this?
Brandon, that is the most beautiful story I've ever heard. I'm sorry I was so angry with you. I love you, Brandon.
I love you too, Timmy. Just as much as I love Exeter for their having great products and for having sponsored this video. Remember to visit the link in the description and use code BrandonF at checkout for up to 45% off your order. And with that, we return to the video.
I think that this also speaks to a second layer behind these myths, something a little bit more ideological than sensationally technical. Because whatever weapon the myth is being touted for, it implies that when an enemy comes across these devices, their only response to them is just brute force. Wow! Sacre bleu, I guess. Look at these incredible new weapon systems. These could revolutionize the way that warfare is waged. Should we, the French, who have made so many sweeping reforms and changes to how we fight, that have ultimately, transformed the doctrines of pretty much every European army, should we study these weapons, perhaps? Should we adapt them to our own use? Could we utilize them? I mean, after all, we have a couple of captured Windbücher right here. What should we do with them? Well, you know what? No, that's all a little bit too complicated. That's ridiculous. You know what? Just kill them all, and then we'll just keep on doing things the same old way. It immediately portrays this black and white world where one side is using these new developments in a clever and meaningful way, firing behind the rocks and trees with their silent air guns, while the other side is only responding to that with fear and loathing and violence without thought, summary executions on the spot, even if, there's a reason not to do it. Just if you find one with that gun, just kill him right then and there. One side is technological and intelligent, while the other is barbaric and brutally stubborn, which is actually especially ironic given, Austrian military history. But in this case, because the emphasis is also placed on Napoleon himself making this decision, it's also painting him specifically in a very particularly negative way. I mean, look, I'm not a fan of the guy myself, but he wasn't stupid. I mean, okay, a little stubborn, maybe, sure, but he wasn't stupid, especially not in military affairs. And having any kind of policy where you just immediately execute enemy soldiers for ultimately no practical reason, that's going to do nothing beyond furthering inspiring his enemies to further action and everything. It's a silly myth on many different levels. There's no historical record to justify it. It just plain doesn't make a lot of sense. And ultimately, I think it paints, this is the important part, it paints a very flawed picture, not only of how militaries in this time period operated tactically, strategically, and perhaps most importantly of all, logistically, but it also paints a flawed picture of the moral character and even just the outright intelligence of all of these different nations, of the soldiers, of their leaders, of one of the most important time periods in human history. But of course, as well, this is hardly, unfortunately, the only offender, even the worst offender in the realm of popular myths surrounding weapons systems and their practicality during the age of muskets. Not only is it not even the worst offender, it's not even by far the most ridiculous one. This next myth also speaks to a video that I made a few years ago, talking about the inherent advantages of the flintlock musket over a longbow. Well, it was a very pleasant surprise to me just how popular that video became. It inspired a great deal of heated debate in the comments, and even a few reply videos from other channels, which was, well, actually, it was pretty scary to me because it helped me to realize that, well, people in the world actually notice the things that I say on the internet. That's a terrifying moment. But anyways, a lot of the conversation basically amounted to people pointing out that, well, while I was correct, the question itself was so inherently flawed as to make it silly to even bother asking. Again, along the lines of my earlier video about comparison. You can't compare a musket to a bow for all sorts of reasons, and it's a silly conversation to have. It's pretty obvious to most people. But I will defend myself here, because ultimately I did know that at the time, and I acknowledged it in the video. In fact, as I said in the video, the reason why I was making that comparison was specifically because of a myth that floats around on the internet talking about how the Duke of Wellington himself had at one point requested longbowmen to serve in his army. This in turn raised questions about whether a longbowman would even be valuable in the Peninsular War to start with, to which obviously the answer is no. The answer to that question, for many, many, many reasons, is no, they really wouldn't be. That having a company of longbowmen in really any setting in the Napoleonic era would more or less be a silly, very stupid idea. So here again, we have the same layers, though, to this myth as the last one, which makes it so damaging. It's emphasizing an individual weapons system over logistics and all the other multitude of factors that actually go into military history. It implies that historical figures were, generally speaking, too stupid themselves to see these obvious solutions placed before them. In this case, that bows and arrows were just somehow so much superior to the weapons which had superseded them, centuries ago. Even if it was only in specific circumstances where people are making those arguments, you're implying that all of these military professionals just couldn't see past their own nose to realize that they could be utilizing this device that had a very long, storied history and whatever. Again, if you want to explore that question in detail, what makes it a stupid idea, I'll refer you to that older video. But suffice to say that even if the Duke of Wellington did ask for a force of archers in the Napoleonic Wars, well then far from being an insight worthy of, or rather insight, beyond the backwardness of his time, some, grand sort of revelation that the longbow was actually a super weapon, it wouldn't have been. In actuality, it would have just been an indictment that the Duke wasn't so intelligent as he's made out to be. Again, it's just a stupid idea. But the myth itself here, I think, is worthy of attention. Where does this idea come from? This utterly ridiculous idea that's become so popular in some circles. How did that happen? And for that matter, where do any of these kinds of myths, if there's no grounding in the historical record, where do they come from? Well, thankfully, like I said, that longbow video got the attention of quite a few individuals. And I had my own real starstruck moment when none other than Jonathan Ferguson himself of the Royal Armouries reached out to me about it. He was fascinated by the story just like I was, and he did a little bit of looking into the origins of the myth for me and found out some really great information. Wow, I thought, oh, this is spectacular, a miniature collab with, the main man himself, the Royal Armouries itself. I can make a follow-up video about the topic. I can include the footage. I can talk about all these different, all the different response videos that people made for me. Oh, what a great opportunity to get out there, networking and all that. I kind of sat on that footage then for about 2 years. So, dropped the ball on that one. But anyways, here now we have a time-traveling keeper of firearms and artillery here to tell us about where this crazy idea of Wellington and the longbows actually came from. Take it away, Jonathan.
Hi everyone, and thank you to Brandon for having me on. I'm very pleased to be here. I am Jonathan, keeper of firearms and artillery here at the Royal Armouries in the UK. And when I heard Brandon tell this story, or mentioned this story, that the Duke of Wellington looked to raise a corps of bowmen to fight Napoleon, safe to say my eyebrows were raised as his were. And as I'm not just a student of arms and armour, I'm a student and enthusiast of folklore, mythology, speculative history, but I'm a skeptic, so I always dig into it and try and find what the source might have been, where this might have come from. Is there any truth to it? Because it can be fascinating sometimes as to not only where the things come from, but is there a grain of truth to them? Now, in this case, I really don't think there is. So, long story short, this does appear in at least one proper history book. Now that is Christopher Coker's Wellington, Ethics and War in the 21st Century from 2008. But as is really surprisingly common with books written by actual historians, when it's a throwaway little bit of flavour like this, they don't cite their sources. really frustrating for people like me. But I think I found it. So, in a 2005 book review written by historical fiction author Bernard Cornwell in the Times newspaper, a version of this appears, and it's so similar, I'm pretty sure it's the right one. So this was a book review of Hugh Saw's book, The Crooked Stick. Now obviously Cornwell created Sharp, the character of Sharp, long-running series of books turned into TV movies with the wonderful Sean Bean. But he also created a series on a rather Sharp-esque bowman, archer character as well. So probably why he was invited to write this book review. And the quote here is, "The first Duke of Wellington, no fool, did once inquire whether there were enough archers in England to raise a corps of longbowmen." He then repeated this in a preface that he wrote to an updated edition in 2010 of Robert Hardy's book, The Great Warbow, great book by the way. And that version said, "The English warbow is the most extraordinary weapon. The Duke of Wellington, no fool, wanted to raise a corps of longbowmen, capitalised, to fight Napoleon, but alas, there were not enough trained archers in England." Very reminiscent of 17th century, couple of 18th century lamentations that this old skill of making the bow, of using the bow, of fighting our enemies with it, had all been lost, but very late. And of course attributed to the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. Now, I have no idea where Cornwell picked this up. My suspicion would be the archery community, perhaps, the reenactment community, bit of word of mouth, what we would call in the firearms world FUD law, points if you know the reference. But in the absence of any earlier written evidence, and I could not find a jot prior to 2005, and the sheer implausibility of this idea, I am officially calling shenanigans on this on behalf of the Royal Armouries. So let's see where this goes. If anyone can find anything earlier than 2005 and Bernard Cornwell's rather fanciful view here, please do get in touch with Brandon, and I'm sure he'll let me know as well. So I hope you enjoyed that little bit of dig into history, just a bit of desktop research, nothing too hardcore, but I think it sheds enough light on this to put it to bed. I hope so. So thank you guys. Take care.
So, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to actually take all that much for these myths to get started. One guy throws out a fun fact in a book review, then it gets repeated, winds up on Wikipedia for a little bit, more and more people start talking about it, referencing it, treating it like fact. More and more legitimate publications might even cite it because it's just become this fascinating little tidbit to spice up your own book. And bit by bit, regardless of the veracity of the original research, the myth becomes apparent truth. It's the life cycle of so many of these myths, sort of like how the British musket wasn't really called the Brown Bess, and how the song Black Betty has literally nothing at all to do with it. These simple little seeds of fabrication, of exaggeration, of lies, of ignorance, of whatever it is, whatever the origin, but these little seeds can grow into great rotting vines of falsity, and thence, especially when combined with so many other false ideas of history, they can begin to form some really dangerous ideas that can take over entire narratives. History is a science, and it can be a precarious one, but it's also very important. Historical accuracy matters because even when it comes to these tiny, little, seemingly throwaway details, well, they can have, ultimately, whether on their own or when combined with all these other little misconceptions, they can have wider cultural implications. And all of us, as students of history, need to be careful not to fall prey to them. It's a continuous fight, a glorious struggle against historical inaccuracy and all that. So, in any case, thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video, may have learned a little something new from it. As ever, of course, a special thank you is owed to my supporters on Patreon, without whom I wouldn't be able to make videos like this, to carry on with all of my work. And another, of course, excellent way to support me, if you are so inclined, is to pre-order the book that I am currently working on producing. I'm not going to prattle on about it too much, but if you enjoy military history and are interested in reading about just how miserable it can be, well then something like philosophy might just be for you. It's going to be an anthology-style book series where multiple authors are all going to get together to write articles on the topic of privation, trauma, and horror throughout military history. Myself, I'm going to be writing about the New Orleans campaign of the War of 1812, and the other authors are all already scribbling away busily on their projects. Everything from the American War of Independence to the Crimean War and many, many things in between and outside. So it's open now for you to pre-order for a discounted price. If you're inclined to do so, it would be a massive help because it would help me to actually pay the authors for their work. But do act quickly because those pre-order slots are also running out very quickly and the price will steadily rise as they do. Links are in the description and all that, but otherwise, thank you all again, and until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.